Danger is returning to the high seas. Shipping is under threat again. On the one hand, you have the Yemen-based Houthis. They've been attacking ships that pass through the Red Sea. On the other hand, piracy along the coast of Somalia has reared its head again. Pirates are trying to take advantage of the Red Sea chaos. As countries display their naval might to ensure maritime security, the spotlight is on global alliances to uphold the freedom of navigation. We ask, how effective will the international task force be in protecting our seas? We welcome to the panel Mariya Didi. Mariya Didi is the former Minister of Defense of the Maldives and was the first woman to be appointed to the position. She is also a former member of the Maldivian Parliament and continues to be a leading human rights activist. Christopher Clary is an international affairs analyst and an associate professor of political science at the University of Albany, State University of New York. Renato de Castro is a professor in the International Studies Department at Manila's De La Salle University. He is currently the chairholder of the Dr. Aurelio Calderon Chair in the Philippine-American Relation. He's also an international relations and security expert. Moderating this session is Sriparna Pathak, an associate professor at the O.P. Jindal Global University. Her areas of interest are China's domestic policy, trade and economic relations between India and China, and China's foreign policy and economic linkages with the world.
Good evening, everyone. I hope you all had an enjoyable tea break. We have an extremely exciting session. And as has already been stated by our Honorable Minister of State for External Affairs, Meenakshi Lekhi ji, most of the trade happens through seas, yet there are various vulnerabilities in these seas. The examples are myriad. The importance of seas has been proven through different epochs of history. Naval historian Alfred Mahan had also said that national greatness is inextricably linked to the sea with its commercial use in times of peace and control in war. Even in the 21st century, seaborne trade has been pertinent. It has been pertinent even more to Asia's economic growth. Now, this is because sea lanes remain not just strategic highways, but they give access to countries to innumerable resources, even in faraway places. What has been seen in the 21st century is that in addition to traditional security threats, there have been various sorts of non-traditional security threats as well. So, in this context, is it just the prerogative of one entity or one country which is most affected to protect these sea lanes of communication, or could we actually think of a workable international task force? We have three very exciting panelists, and in general, we will talk about the impact of regional conflicts on international maritime security and trade. My question is first to you, Minister Didi. What happens when seas become hotspots of geopolitical tensions? How does your country navigate through such tensions, and how do you think the international community should respond?
Thank you very much. First of all, let me thank Firstpost for inviting me to be on the panel and for the excellent hospitality that they have afforded us while we are here. Secondly, Maldives have been famous in India for the wrong reasons, I would say, especially on the social media. We are not people like that. We love foreigners visiting our country, and we welcome you all to the Maldives. As you were saying, how come Maldives? I mean, like about 10, 15 years ago, or say 25 years ago, you wouldn't see Maldives on a normal map, because it's just so small, cluttered, that people forget that there is a string of islands in the Indian Ocean. That nobody really was worried about that. But if you look at Maldives closely, Maldives is having a territory of about 54,000 square kilometers. That's about the size of France. But 99% of our territory is water. Now, how come Maldives have suddenly become on the chart? People are talking about Maldives. If you look at where we are situated, we have 4 major sea lines of communication that pass through or near our archipelago. The 8-degree channel in the north. Then there is the Cardiva channel in the center of the archipelago. There is the 1.5-degree channel and the equatorial channel in the south of our country. Now, in the Indian Ocean, 1/3 of the trade of the world passes through the Indian Ocean. And the 8-degree channel, through that, we have about, per year, through these 4 channels, 100,000 ship movements. And about 16 million barrels of crude oil and other energy passes through the 8-degree channel on its way from the Suez to the Malacca. So Maldives having, stability, having a rules-based order, having the geographical connections to regional construct has become regional parties with whom we share our seas, our territory, is important for us. And we are an import-based economy. Almost everything that we use are imported. And we are a service-based industry, where, in the sense, tourism, fishing, both of those are important to us. And the threats that we have are transnational threats, like IUU fishing, narco trading, illicit human trafficking, and climate change is an existential threat for us. So like the Asian tsunami, when we had difficulties, we had India come in first as our first responder. When we have these sea lanes of communication and so much oil passes through, we need modern maps and things like this. The last maps of Maldives are those done by the British in the Admiralty days during the 1800s. Even after the tsunami, the Asian tsunami, the seabeds have changed a lot. Some islands have disappeared, new islands are coming up. So we need upgraded hydrography charts and things like this. We have to be part of the international world, the international community. What we cannot afford is a major oil spill or a chemical spill. And if we do have such an accident or incident, we need neighbors. What we saw even in Sri Lanka with the Pearl, the spill in the Indian Ocean also was, India was there to help us, our seas. And if something like that would happen to the Maldives, it is something that would cause, so much detriment to the whole of the country. So as part of the global world, we have to understand and be part of the international community, make sure that we maintain stability in the region, make sure the Indian Ocean is conflict-free, and that we do not have proxy wars or things like this in the Maldives. Peace in our country and in the region is of utmost importance to us, which is why when our government was in power, we saw that we always had good relations with our neighbors and others in the international community, and we were a trusted international partner with all of them. But with the present government, we see that they are also slowly coming to their senses. We see that they are taking, the Maldivian Coast Guard is taking part in the Indian naval games in Visakhapatnam. I think you just finished or it's still ongoing. We see the trilateral exercises, which started off as a bilateral exercise between Maldives and Indian Navy, the Dosti exercises, which is now since 2012. It started in 1991. Since 2012, Sri Lanka joined us and Bangladesh is an observer. They are having these exercises now as we speak in the Maldives, and this is also to help with interoperability and greater coordination in case of any of these security threats that we and others in the region suffer. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Extremely interesting points, and I'm going to probably come back to some of them in the next round. But Professor Clary, just taking off from what Minister Didi said, peace is important. Peace is important not just for Maldives, but for the entire international community. Now, the US is still the leading player in international relations. So, non-traditional security threats, as what is happening in the Red Sea, is a source of concern for the leading player of the international system. So, what are the economic implications of the Red Sea crisis, and how does the US seek to address this? If you could elaborate.
Thanks so much, and thanks to Firstpost for having us, and to our audience for being here on a Saturday night. It shows how serious these topics are, how seriously you take them. The problem for defense professionals is that as you build out the force, you have to build a force that can deal with the threats today as well as the likely threats over the lifetime of a platform, which is several decades. That's a very challenging task. And I think what we're seeing off the coast of Yemen is that we have a quickly evolving low-end threat with very inexpensive, in military terms, platforms able to cause meaningful damage against commercial shipping. And at some level, we're seeing from the US response that US acquisitions can deal with the low-end threat. The US success rate against these targets is probably 90+%, but it's doing so at enormous cost, right? So each standard missile, $1 to $4 million per shot. And then it's not just the cost of the missile, which is non-trivial. It's that the loadout for an early bird carrier is maybe 96 of these vertical launch systems. And not all of those are going to be focused on an air defense role. So as people go around and design ships, what is the appropriate arsenal for these vessels in an environment where there's going to be saturation attacks? And that has meant that every Navy on the planet, if they weren't already seriously invested in anti-drone defenses in the middle of last year, they are by now. And that's going to be lower cost solutions, things with kind of unlimited battery life, or batteries like lasers as well, but and as well as jamming. And then, though, that comes back in this game of cat and mouse, it comes back to defense professionals again. All of the drones that are being fielded now have to deal with an environment by the time they're actually out in the field where there's much greater jammer saturation. And so all of the drones then have to deal with that more difficult electromagnetic spectrum problem. So the US Defense Department, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs recently, sort of says, this campaign in Ukraine, and I think we'll see something similar from the evolution with Yemen, has been like a performance-enhancing drug for US thinking on electromagnetic spectrum, because this is going to be a big challenge, and every drone manufacturer will have to think about how resistant their platforms are to that problem, because the Ukraine has supercharged that dynamic. The additional problem is you don't just have this low-end threat, you have a very capable high-end threat, right? The Chinese threat is unlike anything the world has seen, at least since the Cold War, and maybe even exceeding it, if you look at the percentage of the economy that China is able to throw at this problem compared to the Soviet equivalent. And so you still have big choices, to make. You know, right now in Yemen, the US is able to do some damage limitation strikes because we have air superiority. We can blow up targets that are still on the ground. When one is dealing with China, that's going to be a much more difficult problem set. You know, and for some countries, India vis-a-vis China in a naval scenario, there's basically no ability probably to hold Chinese air-launched anti-ship ballistic missiles at risk, or ground-launched anti-ship ballistic missiles at risk. And I think that's the sort of final point I would say, just to, I have other thoughts about sea control problems in Indian Ocean, but I want to hear from the rest of the panelists as well, is the Houthis, this ragtag group, with a little bit of Iranian help, have managed to show how effective anti-ship munitions of a variety of ways are in the littorals. Littorals are a much easier problem, but the Chinese are a very capable force, and I think the Indian Navy that is being built today will almost certainly have to think about very long-range platforms endangering those vessels. And India has, no doubt, very capable indigenous as well as Israeli origin ship defense mechanisms. But the threat that India is likely to face in the lifetime of the vessels that are being produced right now, that's going to be evolving very quickly, and it's going to put a lot of pressure on everybody in this room.
Professor Clary mentioned the China threat. Now, when we do talk about China, one cannot miss India or Philippines, both of which have different sorts of disputes, but both are hinging on sovereignty. So my question for you, Professor, is how does one think of strategies of international cooperation to address China's maritime expansion? If you could kindly elaborate.
Okay, so you talk about the Philippines. Now we're undergoing a sort of a change in defense outlook because in the last 70 years, the Philippines has primarily focused on internal security. Now, because of, we already use the term Chinese maritime expansion. We don't anymore use the term territorial dispute. The reason is, of course, we have the arbitral ruling, which basically erased any semblance of Chinese historic claim and legal claim on the basis of UNCLOS. We prove it through the arbitral tribunal that, you know, Chinese historic claim is a myth. It never happened. The South China Sea has always been a sea common to all. Never in the history of the South China Sea has China been able to control it. So again, this is a point that we like to raise. So in the light of what we call Chinese maritime expansion, first, of course, we relied on international law, the importance of international law, filing of that claim against China in January 2016. And of course, the ruling came out in 2016. Of course, China ignored the ruling, but of course, it served a very important purpose. It deprived China of any sense of legitimacy in its 9-line claim. Second, of course, is the fact that right now, we are shifting in what we call active archipelagic defense strategy, which, of course, number one, entails buildup of our military capability, shifting the focus of the armed forces of the Philippines away from the army-centric armed forces, focus on internal security, to, of course, external defense, building up our Navy, building a capable anti-access area denial capability. That's why we got the BrahMos. But we are realistic enough to know that there's no way that we could, stand up against China. We're just starting. We cannot develop that capability to be on par with, the largest Navy in the world. China, the plan has now the largest number of ships, in terms of ships, but not necessarily in terms of quality, and of course, in terms of tonnage. But of course, that's a threat we face right now. So we have to rely on, number one, our alliance, treaty alliance with the United States. So we have a problem in terms of littoral operation. We extended the number of enhanced defense cooperating sites wherein the U.S. Armed Forces could operate. Not only, of course, when it comes to the South China Sea. More significantly, north of Luzon, you have, of course, the maritime space, the Luzon Strait. Across the Luzon Strait, you have another brewing maritime tension aside from the South China Sea, China's effort to basically conquer Taiwan. So it's not just the South China Sea. You also have the issue of Taiwan. And of course, we also have to rely on our security partnerships. Aside from our only treaty ally, we have, of course, a very active security partnership with Japan, South Korea, Australia, and of course, right now with India. So this is a reality we face. You can talk about peace, but I would refer back to the old Roman dictum. If you want peace, you have to prepare for war.
Absolutely true. Coming back to you, Minister Didi, as the professor said, that if you want peace, you'll have to prepare for war. You also had mentioned about, a lot of transnational security threats, illegal fishing, human trafficking, etc. Where do these originate from, and how is Maldives looking to address these problems?
The thing is, these, like, for instance, terrorism, transnational threats like narco trading, narco smuggling, human trafficking, human smuggling, and like what we see now as the biggest threat to us is the threat of climate change, where weather patterns are changing. Maldives is only 3 feet above sea level, and each island is very small, only about a football field away we live from the sea. The sea is our home. We are small islands. So if any of these threats are there, I mean, our economy is not that huge that like, say, United States or some other places, and even in those countries we see that they have to form partnerships, they have to form allies as well. So a small country like ours, we have to make sure that we have friendships, we have partners, we have allies who would help us if something like that happens. And India has been our traditional first responder. In 1988, we had your cactus, Operation Cactus, where a bunch of terrorists came and almost took over our country from us. And the Malay water crisis, most recently in COVID, where we had to bring our students from Wuhan, where they were studying. The Indian army helped us, and they delivered food to us. We got vaccines from them. And of course, people like Palki here, our very good friend, she went over to the Maldives. She posted many pictures of her in the social media, which helped Maldives on the road to recovery. A lot of Indian tourists came and helped us. So as partners, not only as security partners, as friends, we have always helped each other. And I think we should remain this way. What is worrying is to see Chinese research ships and all being there in the Maldives, which what we don't want to see is a huge geopolitical competition which may lead to wars, things like this. So instead of us preparing for a war, it is more important for us to avoid war, to maintain peace and stability in the region, so that there is no reason why we should have a full-fledged war in the small or even in the territory of our country and beyond in the Indian Ocean. What we would like to see is peace there. We have managed to maintain peace in the region, and we hope that things would be so. It is most important for us. It is being pro-Maldives when we say that. As I told you, we rely on imports. The seas have to be safe. There cannot be wars. We will, even during the Second World War, our grandpas and all, they said they had to eat, leaf from the shores, which was like, not something that is edible, because no ships could come. Even our most staple food like rice and sugar and all that is imported. Now, if you're talking about tourism, if we lose peace in the Maldives or around the region, no tourist is going to come. And in addition, like threats like terrorism, we are spread over 187 islands, and our resorts are about the similar amount, sporadically spread in the sea. And if suppose some terrorists, like what you saw happen in Bombay, come to any of these resorts and something like the Bali bombing or something happens, it will have a huge impact on an economy like Maldives. So I think for the sake of us and for the region, we have to make sure that we maintain stability and we keep peace and keep our traditional close relationships with our neighbors to make sure that they are at hand whenever we need them.
Thank you, Minister Didi. Professor Clary, I have a question from what Professor Di Castro mentioned. He mentioned Taiwan, and even this year before the elections in Taiwan, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Taiwan had said that they saw the PLA Navy flexing its muscles, and this was done in the wee hours before the elections. During the third Taiwan Straits crisis, the US Navy had a role in just ensuring stability. Heavens forbid, if there is a fourth Taiwan Straits crisis, then what role can the US Navy play?
A Taiwan scenario, thankfully, still is an incredibly daunting problem for the PLA. But the goal of the international community is every time the General Secretary or the PLA Navy commander wakes up in the morning, that they tell themselves that's probably not going to work today, right? I think it would be hard, even though it looks like Russia may eke something out in Ukraine, it's hard to look at what's happening there and think that large-scale conventional warfare is easy. So I think the same trends that make anti-access, air denial so challenging allow states to also push back against Chinese aggression. That BrahMos is a great system for this, the ability to locate targets, and the invasion force would be subject to casualty numbers unlike anything people have seen, even including Ukraine, for a generation. So that's a manageable problem, but it will require cooperation. And I think, for the US, as it thinks about a Taiwan scenario, one thing it wants to do is make sure the Indian Ocean is secure in the context of a rapid increase in Chinese shipbuilding. I mean, the amount of tonnage that's come out of there is qualitatively maybe suspect, but not bad. And the tonnage total is one of the most impressive defense buildups, since World War II. And that means that there are going to be more PLA Navy vessels in the Indian Ocean. I'm not so worried about the surface vessels in the event of a conflict. I think the US, with Indian Navy, with perhaps the lead, if there were a Sino-Indian contingency, I think they could. The surface vessels I'm less worried about, but the PLA Navy submarine force is remarkable, and that's a very hard challenge, and that's a challenge that's going to require a lot of ability to pass off information from different specialized anti-submarine warfare specialists from one to another, from the whole chain when those subs leave port in China until they get to the Indian Ocean and when they head back. If there's any break in that chain, if that submarine is lost, it's going to be very difficult to be able to find it again and be successful. And that sort of threat environment, that's just one of like 100 examples of the sort of cooperation that India, the Quad, other partners are going to have to do to deal with a much more serious China threat over the next 20 years.
Professor Di Castro, you mentioned as to how, despite the Hague Tribunal's ruling, and you all have started using the term Chinese expansion. And that's a great beginning because we need to deal with China's discourse power. But that being said, China, even questioned the legitimacy of the Hague Tribunal. It didn't stop creating more artificial islands in your vicinity. And third, last year, it came up with its standardized map, in which not only did it include our territory, but also expanded from the 9-dash line onto the 10-dash line. So the cartographic aggression continues. What could be a plausible, a very rational way to counter this sort of cartographic aggression?
When you talk about strategy, there's two elements there, the rational and irrational. You cannot simply focus on strategy in terms of being rational. You also have to think in terms of how can you counter it. And of course, when you talk of countering it, you talk about building up your capability, coming out with certain strategies that would basically prevent your opponent from being able to implement. Well, of course, the ideal is deterrence, but if deterrence would not work, then you have to look at the possibility, of course, of push comes to shove. So in the case of the Philippines, that's why, of course, we have been forthcoming in allowing, of course, greater U.S. strategic presence in the Philippines. Interestingly, the decision to increase the number of enhanced defense cooperation sites, where, of course, American and probably even Japanese, Australian, any probably Indian could operate, began during the Duterte administration. It's not during the current administration. It's because the Duterte administration implemented a policy of appeasement. Middle in his term, he realized you cannot appease China. How can you talk about peace if you have an expansionist power that could not even be appeased and basically would have to expand? That's their goal. That's the goal of the Communist Party, to basically effect the unification of Taiwan and, of course, push the United States out of the region as a strategic offshore balancer. So again, when you talk about the South China Sea, you also have to talk in terms of the first island chain, and something that we might be discussing later. China's goal is basically to control waters of the first island chain. So how do you deal with a grand strategy like that? So this is really a challenge in terms of, again, when you talk about Quad, when you talk about always looking at the possibility that if peace could not be sustained, how can you basically uphold peace? So again, there's no simple rational solution to the fact that you have a power that is really hell-bent on expansion, driven, of course, by extremely nationalist ideology, controlled by a one-party system, and of course having the second largest economy in the world. That, of course, has the capability to build, at this point in time, the largest navy in the world. I'll just share with you an anecdote that I had during a maritime conference in Singapore a couple of weeks ago. I don't know if you've heard of Colonel Bo, from the Senior, when he said during that conference in front of my American colleagues and friends, China now has the largest navy in the world. So everyone in that room said, oh gosh. So it's getting into their brain. It's getting into their system, despite the fact that, of course, quantity use navy is still an edge. Now you're dealing with an opponent who's starting to believe its own propaganda. So how can you deal rationally with such an opponent?
I think we've run out of time, and there could have been many more discussions and questions, but thank you for kindly bearing with me and all my questions. We should have a big round of applause for the panelists.
Thank you to all of our panelists. May I request our moderator, Dr. Sriparna Pathak, to stay on the stage? We'll just honor all of our panelists.